There is a garden in Isfahan that no longer exists. The walls that once enclosed it have crumbled back into the dust they came from. The roses that climbed those walls, deep red, almost black at the center, have been gone for 900 years. The fountain that once murmured at the garden's heart has been silent for so long that even the silence has forgotten the sound of water. But the story that happened inside those walls, it never quite finished happening. This is the kind of story that was never written down, not in the official histories, not in the court records, not in the ledgers of merchants or the journals of travelers passing through Isfahan on their way to somewhere more important. It was passed instead the way all true stories are passed, in whispers, between women in bathhouses, between old men who remembered hearing it from their grandmothers, between lovers, late at night when the world outside had gone completely still. And so it came, finally, to us. Her name was Shireen, which in the old Persian tongue means sweet. The people who named her could not have known how precisely they had chosen, or perhaps they did. Perhaps parents have always known more than children give them credit for. Shireen was the wife of a man named Kaveh al-Rashid, a silk merchant of considerable reputation and even more considerable wealth. His name was known from the bazaars of Isfahan all the way to the trading ports of the Caspian coast. Bolts of silk moved through his warehouses the way water moves through a river, constantly, effortlessly, in quantities that made other merchants lower their eyes when he passed. He was not a cruel man. This is important to understand. He was simply a man of his time and his station. He understood the world in terms of value, in terms of weight and quality and the precise calculation of worth. He had married Shireen when she was 19 and he was 43. He had paid her father a bride price that made the entire neighborhood talk for 3 months. And he had installed her in his house, which was large and cool and very, very quiet, with the same careful satisfaction a man might feel placing a fine piece of jade on a shelf. Beautiful, valuable, perfectly positioned, and absolutely, completely still. The house had many rooms. A reception hall with carved plaster ceilings that caught the morning light, a kitchen that smelled of turmeric and charred bread, servants' quarters along the eastern wall, a bedroom with silk curtains, naturally, in deep saffron and indigo. And at the very back of the house, separated from the main building by a narrow covered walkway, the garden. It was not an enormous garden, perhaps 30 steps across and 40 steps long, though Shireen had walked its perimeter so many times she had stopped counting. There was a central fountain, octagonal, lined with blue tilework from Kashan. There were rose bushes, the dark red ones, climbing the southern wall. There was a pomegranate tree in the northwest corner that fruited every year with a kind of stubborn reliability that Shireen found both comforting and slightly heartbreaking. There were jasmine vines along the north wall that bloomed in late spring and filled the entire garden with a smell so heavy and sweet it was almost painful. And there was a stone bench beside the fountain where Shireen spent every afternoon that God and her husband's schedule allowed. She brought books to that bench, poetry mostly, al-Mutanabi, Rudaki, Ferdowsi when she was feeling brave enough for the weight of him. She would sit with her feet tucked beneath her and read until the light changed, that specific Isfahan light, golden and slightly hazy, that turned everything it touched the color of old honey. It was the only hour of her day that belonged entirely to herself. The garden had always been tended by an old man named Hoshong. He had worked for Kavi's family since before Kaveh himself was born. He knew every plant in that garden by its particular temperament. He knew which roses needed coaxing and which needed to be left alone. He knew exactly how much water the pomegranate tree wanted in July and how much less it wanted in August. He also knew, without ever being told, that the garden was Shireen's sanctuary, and he had always worked around her quietly, pruning and watering, and muttering softly to the roses in a dialect so old Shireen couldn't quite catch the words, with a kind of respect that she had never needed to ask for, and had always been grateful for. Then, in the spring of Shireen's 4th year in the house, Haoshang's back finally gave out entirely. He could no longer kneel, could no longer carry the heavy clay water jars from the well to the rose beds, could no longer climb the low wooden ladder to trim the jasmine from the top of the wall. Kaveh, with the efficiency he applied to all logistical problems, hired a replacement within the week. And so one morning in early April, when the jasmine was just beginning to think about blooming, Shireen came to her bench to find a stranger in her garden. He was young. She registered this first, almost clinically, the way you register the temperature of water before stepping into it. He was crouched near the base of the pomegranate tree, examining the soil around its roots with an attention that was almost medical. He had pushed his sleeves to his elbows. His forearms were dark from the sun. His hands, pressing carefully into the earth, were the hands of someone who had spent years learning to read the ground the way scholars read pages. He had not heard her come in. She stood at the entrance to the garden for a moment, just a moment, watching him work. There was something almost unbearably focused about the way he moved, the way he pressed 2 fingers gently into the soil beside the root, then lifted them and rubbed the earth between them, testing its moisture, its texture, its particular story. It was an intimate gesture, private, the kind of thing you do when you believe no one is watching. Shireen cleared her throat. He stood immediately, turned, and she saw his face. He was perhaps 25, perhaps a little less. He had the kind of face that the poets described as moon-like, and Shireen, who had read enough poetry to be tired of the comparison, found to her irritation that it was the only comparison that came to mind. Not because he was conventionally beautiful, though he was, but because his face had that quality of reflected light, as if some other, warmer source was illuminating him from somewhere she couldn't see. He bowed his head immediately, touched his chest. "My lady, forgive me. I was told you do not come until the afternoon." "I came early," she said. "You will work elsewhere until you—" "You don't have to," she said. The slightest pause in the narration, as if even the story is surprised. She was surprised herself. She had not planned to say it. He looked up, and there was something in his eyes, not boldness, not calculation, just a kind of open, uncomplicated curiosity, as if she were an interesting problem he was trying to understand. "Thank you, my lady," he said. And he went back to his work, and Shireen went to her bench, and opened her book, and read not a single word of it for the next hour. His name was Dara. She learned this not by asking him directly. That would have been too deliberate, too conscious of itself. She learned it by listening 2 days later, when one of the kitchen servants called to him through the garden gate about a water jar that needed refilling. Dara, an old name, a king's name in the ancient stories, a name that meant he who holds firm. She turned the name over in her mind that afternoon, the way you turn a smooth stone in your hand, not quite sure why you've picked it up, not quite willing to put it down. The days that followed had a particular quality that Shirin would spend years afterward trying to describe to herself accurately. They were ordinary days. She came to the garden, she read, he worked. The fountain made its small, continuous sound. The roses opened, one by one, with the unhurried confidence of things that have been blooming for centuries and intend to continue. But there was something else, a quality of attention, on both sides, though neither acknowledged it, a slight recalibration of the body, the way you position yourself in a room when someone you are aware of is also in the room, not facing them, not deliberately turned away, simply oriented, like a compass finding north without being asked. The first time they actually spoke, beyond those first 3 sentences, it was about a book. She had been reading Rudaki, a particular poem about autumn, the one that begins with the wind and ends with the heart. She had read it so many times that the words had begun to separate from their meanings, the way a word does when you repeat it too often. She was frowning at the page. "Is it a difficult text, my lady?" She looked up. He was at the rose bed, not looking at her, pruning shears in one hand. "Not difficult," she said. "Familiar, which is sometimes its own difficulty." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother used to say that a poem you have memorized is like a road you have walked so many times you have stopped seeing it." Shirin looked at him. "Your mother read poetry?" "She could not read," he said simply. "She remembered. There is a difference." Shirin set the book down on her knee. What did she remember? And here the narration softens to almost nothing, and Dara, still not looking at her, still moving the pruning shears carefully on a rose stem, began to recite. It was an old piece, older than Rudaki, older perhaps than the city of Isfahan itself. A poem in a dialect Shirin only half recognized, about a woman standing at the edge of a river in the early morning, watching the mist rise from the water. His voice reciting it was very low, and the garden was very still, and the fountain for a moment seemed to be listening. Summer arrived in Isfahan the way it always did, not gradually, but all at once, like a decision. The heat descended on the city in the first week of June and pressed everything flat and golden and slow. The bazaars opened earlier and closed by midday. The streets emptied by noon. Even the flies seemed to move more slowly, drifting through the hot air with a kind of philosophical resignation. In the garden, the jasmine had reached its peak. It bloomed in white clusters so dense they were almost architectural, thick ropes of blossoms hanging from the north wall with a weight and a fragrance that on still evenings drifted through the entire back quarter of the house. Shirin began coming to the garden earlier, before the worst of the heat, sometimes before sunrise, when the air still held the night's coolness like a cup holds water, carefully, knowing it won't last. Dara was always already there. He arrived, she discovered, before dawn. He worked in the early hours when the ground was still cool enough to turn without cracking. By the time she appeared at the garden gate, he would typically be finishing the heaviest work, the watering, the turning of soil, then moving to the more delicate tasks, trimming, tying back new growth, coaxing the roses toward the patches of light that would do them the most good. They had developed, without discussing it, a kind of grammar. She would arrive, he would acknowledge her with a slight incline of his head, never a full bow now, just that tilt, which somehow felt more respectful than formality. She would go to her bench, she would read, or she would simply sit. And at some point, always at some point, a conversation would find its way into the garden the way water finds its way through stone. Not forced, not directed, simply finding the space. They talked about poetry often, about the difference between poems that were made to be read and poems that were made to be heard, about whether a poem that was not sung had lost something essential, or whether it had simply become something else entirely. They talked about the pomegranate tree, which had a personality they both agreed on, stubborn, self-contained, asking for nothing, giving everything. They talked about water, about how Isfahan had been built on the Zayande River and how the city's entire psychology, its sense of itself, its relationship to beauty and permanence had been shaped by the fact of that water moving through it. They talked once about loneliness, not directly, not with that word, but in the way that two people sometimes circle a subject so precisely that they have, in fact, discussed it completely, without ever naming it. It was Shireen who brought it close first. She had been talking about a poem, a particular image in a poem of a bird in a walled garden who had forgotten what the sky looked like. "The poet is not talking about a bird," she said. "No," Dara said. "He is talking about—" "Yes," Dara said. And neither of them said anything else about it. But something had shifted, the way the air shifts just before rain, not yet changed, but irrevocably changing. It was a Tuesday in late July when he first touched her hand. It was not romantic, not in the way the word romantic suggests intention, performance, awareness of itself. She had been holding out a small cutting knife she'd brought to trim a particular stem she'd noticed, a wild shoot growing from the base of the jasmine that was beginning to crowd the rosebed. She'd noticed it for days, and finally brought the knife without mentioning she intended to do anything about it. She held it out to him because he was closer to the vine and had both hands free. He reached for the knife, and his fingers closed over hers, not over the handle, over her fingers, for just a moment, 2 seconds at most, his hand warm and rough and smelling of earth and something green and living. She did not move for a long moment. She was aware of her hand, of the exact shape of where his fingers had been, of the warmth that remained there like an afterimage. She walked back to her bench. She sat down. She opened her book. She looked at the same page for the rest of the afternoon. That night, in the large and quiet bedroom with the saffron curtains, Shireen lay awake long after her husband's breathing had deepened into sleep. The room was dark. A small oil lamp burned in the corner, low, almost extinguished. Through the window, the stars over Isfahan were very clear, the kind of clear that only comes in high summer when the air is so dry it seems to have been polished. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and tried to understand what she was doing. She was not foolish. She had not been foolish since she was 19 years old, and had learned, quickly and without drama, what the world she lived in expected of her. She understood the geometry of her life, its walls, its distances, its permitted movements. She understood it the way you understand the dimensions of a room you have lived in for years, not as confinement, but simply as the shape of things. And yet, there is a particular kind of knowledge that the body holds separately from the mind, a particular understanding that does not pass through reason, that cannot be argued with or adjusted or redirected. Her hand, against the cool linen of the bed, could still feel the ghost of those fingers. She turned on her side, closed her eyes, listened to the silence of the house, which was deep and complete, and punctuated only by the distant, sleepless sound of Isfahan at night. A dog somewhere, a wheel on stone, the faint memory of the river. Tomorrow she would go to the garden. Tomorrow the pomegranate tree would stand in its corner with its ancient patience. Tomorrow the jasmine would hang from the north wall, heavy and white and impossible. And Dara would already be there, working in the early light, his hands in the earth, his voice, if she was lucky, carrying some fragment of an old poem his mother had once memorized and pressed into him like a mark. Shirin closed her eyes, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she was not dreading the morning. And so, we leave her there, in the dark, in the quiet, on the edge of something she has not yet named and is not yet ready to name. The garden is still outside. The roses are sleeping. The fountain has lowered itself to its nighttime murmur, barely a sound, more like the memory of a sound. The stars over Isfahan are burning with the absolute, impersonal brightness of stars that have seen 1,000 such nights and will see 1,000 more. Everything continues in the morning. We return to Isfahan, to the garden, to the particular quality of light that exists only in the hour before the sun fully commits to the day. That blue-gray softness that makes every surface look like it has been painted in watercolor, still wet, still possible. You remember where we were. A woman on a bench, a man with earth on his hands, a knife passed between them, 2 seconds of contact that neither mentioned and neither forgot. The summer was not finished with them yet. August arrived. In Isfahan, August was the month of endurance, the month when the city turned its face slightly away from the world and simply waited for the heat to pass, for the angle of the sun to shift, for the particular mercy of September. The roses had finished their summer blooming and were resting. The jasmine was beginning to thin, but the pomegranate tree, stubborn, faithful, asking nothing, had begun to show the first swellings of fruit along its branches, small, tight, the deep green of something that knew exactly what it was going to become and was in no hurry about it. Shirin noticed things differently now. This was the change she was most aware of, not in her feelings, which she was still not quite examining directly, the way you avoid looking at a bright light, not because you are afraid of it, but because you understand that looking directly will change your ability to see everything else. No, the change was in her noticing. She noticed the way Dara moved through the garden with a specific economy, no wasted gesture, no unnecessary step. The way a man moves who has learned to trust his body completely. She noticed the way he tilted his head slightly when he was thinking, the way he was never still, always some small movement, fingers working a leaf, foot turning a stone, as if stillness was something he had never quite learned the use of. She noticed his voice, not what it said, the quality of it, the particular depth of it in the early morning before the day had fully warmed it. the way it dropped even lower when he was reciting something from memory, as if the words deserved a register he did not use for ordinary things. She noticed, this above all, the way he listened.
Most people, when you spoke to them, were preparing their response. You could feel it, the slight withdrawal of attention, the eyes that were present but already somewhere else, composing. With Dara, when she spoke, there was no sense of that. There was only the sense of being completely received, of every word landing somewhere that mattered. She had not understood until she experienced its opposite, how rare this was. It was in the second week of August that the poetry began in earnest. She had brought, that morning, a collection she had not opened in years, a copy of the Shahnameh, Ferdowsi's great epic that had belonged to her father. The pages were thick and slightly wavy with age. The margins were full of her father's handwriting, small and precise, noting words he had needed to look up, lines he had found particularly affecting. She was reading the passage about Zal and Rudabe, the great forbidden love story at the heart of the epic, the white-haired warrior and the princess who let down her hair from a tower like a rope so he could climb to her. And she said, "Take my hair, which is my glory and my gift, and let it be the road between us." She looked up. Dara had gone completely still, at the rosebed, his back to her, pruning shears in his hand, not moving. "That is the version I know," he said after a moment. "You know the Shahnameh?" "Pieces of it," he said. "My mother again." "Your mother," Shireen said, "was an extraordinary woman." She was ordinary. She simply paid attention to beautiful things. She looked down at the page, at Ferdowsi's words, at her father's notes in the margin, his familiar handwriting, which she had not looked at in 4 years. "Read me something," she said. It was the most direct thing she had ever said to him. He set down the shears. He sat on the ground, not on the bench, not presuming the bench, but on the ground near the rosebed, with his knees drawn up, and he recited from memory for nearly an hour. Old poems, his mother's poems, fragments of Ferdowsi, something in the old dialect she had heard once before, that poem about the woman at the river's edge, something else she did not recognize at all, shorter, simpler, a poem that seemed to be about a garden, about a fountain, about someone sitting very still and listening. She did not ask who had written it. She suspected, she already knew. There is a particular moment in the development of feeling, not love, not yet, or perhaps it is love, but not yet willing to be called that, when the ordinary world becomes unbearably beautiful. Shireen began experiencing the garden this way. The fountain, which she had always found pleasant, now seemed to be speaking a language she was just on the verge of understanding. The pomegranate fruit, deepening now from green toward the first hints of red, seemed to be documenting something. Even the shadows the garden wall threw across the tilework in the late afternoon, long, precise, moving so slowly you could only detect their movement by looking away and looking back, seemed meaningful in a way she could not articulate. This is what certain people do to the world around them. They make it luminous. They make it, without trying, more itself. She understood now why the poets never wrote about ordinary afternoons. The ordinary afternoon does not need a poem. It is only the afternoon that has been transformed by proximity, by attention, by the specific alchemy of one person being near another in a garden while the fountain murmurs and the roses sleep,
that requires language to survive. She was, she realized, living inside a poem. She was not sure yet whether this was a gift or a warning. Kaveh came home early on a Thursday in late August. He was not expected until evening. A meeting in the bazaar had concluded faster than anticipated. He came through the main door, handed his outer robe to a servant, asked for tea and something cold, and then, as he sometimes did, with the proprietary ease of a man checking on his holdings, walked through the narrow covered walkway toward the garden.
Shireen heard the walkway door. She and Dara had been sitting, she on the bench, he again on the ground near the pomegranate tree, in the middle of a conversation about whether language could survive translation, or whether every translated poem was in fact a new poem entirely. At the sound of the door, Dara stood in a single fluid movement. By the time Kaveh appeared in the garden entrance, Dara was at the far rose bed, pruning shears in hand, demonstrably working. Shireen had not moved from the bench. She looked up at her husband with the composed expression she had perfected over 4 years of marriage. Present, pleasant, slightly distant, like a landscape painting that has captured the light of a specific afternoon and cannot be asked to change. "You are home early," she said. "The meeting concluded," he said. He looked around the garden with the assessing gaze he applied to all his properties. His eyes moved to the rose bed, to Dara's back. "The roses look well," he said. "He works carefully," Shireen said. Kaveh nodded, already half-turned back toward the house, his attention having completed its circuit and found everything in order. "Come inside when you are done," he said. "I have things to discuss about the autumn journey to Shiraz." "Yes," she said. And he was gone.
The garden was exactly as it had been before. The fountain, the pomegranate tree, the roses, the long afternoon light. But something had been disturbed in it. Some membrane, thin as the surface of water, had been touched. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Dara, without turning from the rosebed, said very quietly, "I will finish early tomorrow. You will have the garden to yourself." "No," Shireen said. Her own voice surprised her, its certainty. "Come at your usual time," she said. He turned just enough for her to see the side of his face. "My lady," he said, and his voice held something she had not heard in it before, something careful and serious and full of an understanding she had not given him, but that he had arrived at on his own. "My lady, I think you know what I am trying to say." "I know," she said. And yet, she agreed. September came to Isfahan like a relief. The heat broke in the first week, not gradually, but in a single night, when a wind came down from the mountains and moved through the city with a gentle, sweeping authority, taking the summer with it the way a careful hand clears a table. The next morning, the air was different, cooler, lighter. It smelled of something that was not quite autumn yet, but was clearly no longer summer. That transitional smell, like turned earth and stone that has been allowed to cool. The pomegranate fruit had deepened to red. In the garden, Shireen and Dara marked the change of season without commenting on it, the way you acknowledge something significant by simply being present to it together.
She brought a new book, a slim volume, handwritten, that she had found in her husband's library, and which turned out to be a collection of ghazals by a poet she had never heard of. She read them slowly, sometimes aloud, sometimes not. Dara listened when she read aloud, and sometimes responded with something from memory that rhymed in spirit, if not in form. They had developed, without planning it, a kind of call and response, a conversation that had been going on all summer and had accumulated by September a weight and texture and history that could not be reduced to any individual exchange. It was the conversation itself, not any particular thing said in it, that had become the thing, the ongoing fact of it.
The ongoing fact of two people paying precise and serious attention to each other in a garden where the pomegranates had gone red and the fountain continued its single, endlessly patient note. It was the last Tuesday of September. The day was clear and mild, with the particular golden quality of autumn light that makes every object look as if it has been carefully considered by the sun before being illuminated. Shireen came to the garden later than usual. She had been delayed. Her husband's household, his accounts, the accumulating obligations of a merchant's wife in the season before the trading journeys began. By the time she came through the garden gate, the afternoon was already half spent. Dara was at the pomegranate tree. He had a fruit in his hand, one of the red ones, fully ripe, heavy with what it contained. He had been examining it with that particular focused attention he gave to things he found significant. He heard her and turned, and something in his face, in the unguarded moment before he had composed it, showed her everything. She did not look away, neither did he. She walked across the garden, not to the bench, to the pomegranate tree. She stopped 2 steps from him, close enough to see the fine texture of the fruit's skin, the particular depth of the red. "Is it ready?" she asked. He looked down at the pomegranate, then back at her. "Yes," he said. He held it out to her. She took it. Their hands did not need to touch this time. The space between them was doing all the work that touching could have done, charged, specific, full of everything that had been accumulated since April. "In the old stories," she said quietly, "the pomegranate is a threshold. Eating it binds you to a place, commits you to a world." "I know the stories," Dara said. "Which world?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was very quiet. "The one that is already real," he said. "The one we are already living in, whatever it is, and whatever it costs."
Shireen looked at the pomegranate. Then she looked up at him, and she understood in that moment that she had made her choice some time ago, probably in April, in the first hour, watching his hands press into the earth beside the pomegranate tree's roots. Perhaps even before that, perhaps in some earlier version of herself that had been waiting, without knowing what it was waiting for precisely this garden and precisely this man. She broke the pomegranate open with both hands. The seeds inside were the color of garnets, of old wine, of the last light over Isfahan when the sun finally relinquishes the city to the night. She held half toward him. He took it. They ate without speaking, standing beside the old tree in the September light, the fountain behind them murmuring its single note, the roses on the southern wall resting, the jasmine long finished but still holding, in the bare architecture of its vines, the memory of its blooming. When they had finished, she looked at her hands, stained dark red at the fingertips, the palms, the creases of her knuckles. "These won't wash out easily," she said. "No," he agreed. "They won't." It was not about the pomegranate. What happened in that garden in the days that followed is the part of the story that was told most differently in different tellings. In some versions they were discovered, In some versions they were not. In some versions the merchant Kaveh departed for Shiraz, and the garden had the long, quiet autumn to itself, to them. In some versions the story ended in tragedy. In some it ended in something that was not quite happiness, but was not unhappiness either. Something older and more complex than either, the way real lives tend to end. The truth is that no one knows how it ended. Because the story was never written down, because it lived, as we said at the beginning, in whispers, between women in bathhouses, between old men and their grandchildren, between lovers late at night, when the particular silence of the sleeping world made certain things possible to say. And because every person who told it understood instinctively that the ending was not the point. The point was the Gunudin. The point was the April morning, and the stranger crouched beside the pomegranate tree, and the woman standing at the gate watching him work. The point was the summer, long, still, golden, full of poetry, and the fountain's murmur, and two people finding in each other the specific quality of attention they had not known they were missing. The point was the pomegranate, broken open in the September light, the stain on her fingers, his voice saying, "The one that is already real." These things happened. Whatever came after, they happened, and in the telling of them, they happen again, and again, and again. And so we close the gates of that garden now, gently, as you close a book that has asked something of you, as you close your eyes at the end of a day that contained more beauty than you expected. Isfahan is quiet tonight. The city that exists now, 900 years after this story took place, is full of its own light, its own noise, its own loves and complications. But somewhere beneath it, in the geological memory of the place, the garden is still there, the fountain still murmuring, the pomegranate tree still standing in its corner, with its ancient patience, the stone bench still holding the warmth of an afternoon that ended centuries ago. And maybe, if you go there in your sleep, in that free and weightless movement that sleep allows, maybe you can find it, the blue-gray light of the early morning, the smell of jasmine, heavy and sweet and almost painful, the sound of a man reciting poetry his mother taught him, in a dialect older than the city, in a voice pitched low for an audience of one. Let that be the last thing. That voice, the garden, the light, particular, irreplaceable weight of being seen by someone who is paying complete attention. You are allowed to rest now. You have been paying attention all evening. Let the garden hold you for a while. Let Isfahan be quiet around you. Let the fountain speak for everyone. Sleep now.
There's a place in the Appalachian Mountains, not on any map you'd find at a gas station, not in any GPS, not in any travel guide, where the trees grow so thick and so tall that the sky becomes just a rumor, a thin blue suggestion between the branches, something you half remember, like a dream you had when you were very small. People in the nearest town, and that town was 40 minutes away on a dirt road that turned to mud every March and stayed that way until June. People there called it the Hollow, not a hollow, the hollow, like there was only one, like the word itself was a warning. Nora Callahan grew up in the Hollow. She was 23 years old, lived alone in the house her grandmother had left her, and she had never once in her life felt afraid of the forest. That was the first thing you needed to know about Nora. She was not afraid. Not of the dark between the trees, not of the sounds that came after midnight, the low, dragging sounds that most people convinced themselves were just raccoons, just deer, just the wood settling in the cold. not of any of it. She'd grown up hearing her grandmother say, "The forest doesn't want to hurt you, child. The forest doesn't want anything. Only people want things. Only people are dangerous." Nora had believed that. For 23 years, she had believed that completely. Her house sat at the end of a gravel path that was technically a driveway, though it hadn't seen a car in 3 years. She drove a rusted Ford pickup that she parked at the base of the hill and walked up every evening, grocery bags in both hands, boots crunching on loose stone. The house itself was old. Not charming old, not rustic old. Old in the way that things get when they've absorbed too many years, too many winters, too many people living and dying inside their walls. The wood had gone grey, the porch sagged slightly to the left. The windows had that particular wavy quality of very old glass, so that if you looked through them at the wrong angle, the trees outside seemed to ripple, seemed to move, even when there was no wind. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. Her grandmother had hung bundles of them from every ceiling beam, lavender and sage, and something else Nora had never been able to identify, something darker, something that smelled like earth after rain, like something that had been buried and dug back up. Her grandmother had called it keeping the house honest. Nora had never asked what that meant. Now her grandmother was gone, and there was no one left to ask. She worked remotely, data entry for a logistics company in Charlotte that she'd never visited in person. She sat at a wooden desk by the window every morning from 7 until noon, entering numbers into spreadsheets, and then she stopped. That was her workday. Afternoon, the hours belonged to her. She walked the forest. She tended the garden, mostly herbs, mostly the same ones her grandmother had grown, though she'd never really understood what half of them were for. She cooked simple things. She read until her eyes got heavy. She slept. She was, by most measures, lonely. But loneliness and solitude are two different countries, and Nora had always lived happily in the second one. Or she had, until the summer she turned 23. Until the summer she started hearing the sound. It started in June. A low sound, just at the edge of hearing. Something between a hum and a whistle. Something that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. From the tree line, from under the ground, from somewhere behind her own sternum. She heard it first on a Tuesday night. She was reading in bed, the old lamp on the nightstand throwing orange light across the pages, and it was past midnight, and the forest outside was doing its usual thing, the crickets, the wind, the distant something that might have been a fox, when the sound began. She put her book down, listened. It stopped. She picked the book back up. It started again. She went to the window. The tree line was 40 feet from the house, a wall of black between the trunks, and nothing was moving, and the sound was still there, and then it wasn't, and then the night was just the night again. Raccoons, she told herself, deer, the wood settling in the warm. She went back to bed. She did not immediately fall asleep. By July, she had heard the sound 11 more times. She had stopped counting after 11 because counting made it feel like something worth counting. She did not want it to be something worth counting. But on a Friday night in the second week of July, she heard it again, and this time she did not put her book down slowly, did not go quietly to the window. This time she was already at the window. Because she had been watching the tree line. She hadn't told herself she was doing it. She just found herself there, sitting in the chair by the window after dark, not reading, not doing anything, just watching the trees. And when the sound came, she was watching, and something moved. at the very edge of the tree line, at the place where the moonlight gave up and the dark began, something shifted. Not an animal, or not the shape of an animal. It was tall. That was the first thing. It was the height of a man, more than 6 feet, and it was standing upright on 2 legs, the way a person stands when they're looking at something from a distance and they don't want to be seen. Nora's hand found the window latch. She didn't open it. The shape stood there for a long moment, long enough that she began to wonder if it was just a trick of the moonlight, just a particular arrangement of shadows that her tired brain had assembled into a silhouette. And then it moved back, 1 step, into the dark, and was gone.
She told herself it was a hiker. The Appalachian Trail ran within 20 miles of her property. Hikers got lost. Hikers wandered off trail. It wasn't impossible. She told herself that in the morning, over coffee, in the reasonable light of a July sunrise. She almost believed it. Almost. 3 nights later, he knocked on her door. She heard the knock at 11:15 p.m., and she sat completely still on the couch for a full minute before she got up. Her grandmother had kept a shotgun under the stairs. Nora took it out. She'd never actually fired it, but she carried it to the door and she stood behind it and she said, "Who's there?" And the voice that answered was the most beautiful voice she had ever heard, low, even, unhurried. The voice of someone who had never once in their entire life needed to raise it. "I'm sorry to bother you," it said. "I've been walking a long time. I saw your light." Nora stood with the shotgun in her hands. "What do you want?" A pause. "Water," the voice said, "if you can spare it." She opened the door. She would think about that moment many times in the months that followed, the opening of the door. She would try to identify the exact thing that made her do it. Was it the voice? Was it the phrasing, "if you can spare it," that particular gentleness of it? Was it simply loneliness, the 8 months since she'd spoken to another human being face to face? She never came up with a good answer. She opened the door, and he was standing on her porch. He was tall, she'd been right about that from the window, well over 6 feet, dark hair, a little too long, a face that was, she would later struggle to describe this, a face that was almost right, like someone had been given a description of a handsome man and done an excellent, careful job of recreating one. High cheekbones, dark eyes, very dark, almost no distinction between iris and pupil in the porchlight, a mouth that seemed to rest naturally in something just short of a smile. He was wearing a flannel shirt and dark pants and boots that had genuine trail mud on them. He looked like a hiker. He looked completely, entirely normal. "Thank you," he said when he saw her. Not "thank you for opening the door," just "thank you," like he'd already known she would. She did not let him inside. She was not that trusting. She filled a glass of water at the kitchen sink and brought it to the porch doorway. And he took it and drank it slowly. And she stood in the porch doorway with the screen door between them and watched him. "My name's Cahill," he said. "Just Cahill?" "It's what people call me." "Are you lost?" He smiled. And there it was, the thing she would think about later. The first thing that was not quite right. The smile went all the way across his face in a way that was technically correct. Technically what a smile looked like, but which lasted about half a second too long before it settled. Like he'd had to make a small adjustment. Like something had needed calibrating. "Not anymore," he said. He told her he'd been hiking for 3 weeks. Told her he'd come down from Vermont, following the ridgeline. No particular destination.
"You been sleeping outside this whole time?" "Mostly," he said. "Where's your gear?" She looked at him. "I travel light." She looked at him. No pack, no sleeping bag, no tent roll, no water bottle of his own, which was why, presumably, he'd knocked on her door. A man who'd been hiking alone in the Appalachians for 3 weeks with no gear. She should have closed the door. She did not close the door. "You can sleep on the porch," she said. "There's an old chair that unfolds. I'll get you a blanket." He was still there in the morning. She'd half expected him to be gone. Had almost hoped he would be, honestly. Because then she could have told herself the whole thing was fine and harmless. And she could stop thinking about the half-second smile. But he was there, sitting in the folded chair, wide awake, watching the tree line. "Did you sleep?" she asked. He turned to look at her. "Some," he said. She brought him coffee. He drank it, though she noticed he held the mug strangely, carefully, like something he'd seen people do rather than something he'd done 10,000 times himself. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I know," he said. "But you're going to." He looked at her with those very dark eyes. "Do you want me to leave?" She thought about it for a moment that lasted slightly longer than was comfortable. "Not yet," she said. He stayed for 3 days. In those 3 days, she learned the following things about him. He did not eat much. She made eggs one morning, and he ate 2 bites and then left the plate. And when she asked if he was hungry, he said he was fine, in a way that suggested the question itself was slightly puzzling to him, as though hunger was something he understood in theory. He did not sleep, or barely slept, or slept in a way that didn't look like sleeping. She woke at 2 a.m. on the second night and looked out, and he was in the yard, standing perfectly still, facing the trees, not pacing, not wandering, standing, the way something stands when it is listening with its entire body. He was extraordinarily still. That was the main thing, actually, the stillness. Most people are in some kind of constant micro-motion, fidgeting, shifting weight, touching their face. Cahill was not. When he sat without moving. When he stood like something that had decided to be in that exact location and had no doubts about it. It should have been unnerving. It was, instead, oddly peaceful. Like being near a very old tree, she thought, like standing next to something that had made its peace with being where it was. On the second evening, they sat on the porch, and she opened a bottle of wine, and he held a glass of it, and she wasn't sure he actually drank any. "Tell me something about yourself," she said. "What do you want to know? Anything. Where you're from, what you do, how old you are." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm from here," he said. "Vermont?" "No, here, this." He gestured at the trees, the dark between them, the specific quality of mountain air at dusk. "Places like this. I've always been in places like this." "That's not really an answer." "I know." She looked at him sideways. "How old are you?" The half-second smile again. "Older than I look," he said. On the third morning, she found the shed skin. She went out early, before he was up, or before he was in the yard at least. She couldn't be sure he'd been inside. And she walked to the garden to check on the tomatoes, and it was there, in the grass along the garden's edge. Long, very long. Shed snakeskin, she thought, immediately, because that's what it looked like, the dry, papery, translucent casing of something that had outgrown itself. Except snakeskin came in segments, came in the diameter of a snake's body. This was wider. This was much, much wider, the width, roughly, of a human torso. She crouched over it for a long time without touching it. It was dry and pale and caught the morning light in a way that made it look almost like old parchment, like something you could write on. She heard the porch door open. She stood up quickly. Cahill came around the side of the house and stopped when he saw her and looked at her face and then looked at the ground in front of her, and something moved behind his dark eyes. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to guilt. Something like the feeling you get when you've left something out that you'd meant to put away. "That's not what you think," he said. "I don't know what I think," she said. He was quiet. "Should I be afraid of you?" she asked. He looked at her for a long time. "No," he said. "That's exactly what something I should be afraid of would say." "Yes," he agreed. "It is." She did not ask him to leave. She has thought about why many times. She is a practical person. She is a person who makes sensible decisions. She is not, by any measure, naive. But she did not ask him to leave. "There is something I should tell you about Nora Callahan, and it is this. She had been lonely for a very long time. Not the ordinary loneliness of a person who doesn't get out much. Something older than that. Something that had been with her since childhood. This feeling of being adjacent to the world rather than in it, of watching people through glass.
She had never found another person who gave her the feeling of being genuinely met. Until him. Whatever he was, he met her in that particular way. He looked at her and she had the sense of being seen clearly, without judgment, without performance. The way you feel in deep woods, actually, when there's no one around and you don't have to be anything in particular. She knew that probably made her a fool. She stayed a fool. On the fourth day, she asked him directly. She was standing in the kitchen and he was leaning in the doorway. Always that stillness, that unhurried presence, and she turned from the stove and looked at him and said, "What are you?" Not a question, a demand. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "I think you already know. I want to hear you say it." "Why?" "Because I need to know if you're going to lie to me." He was quiet for a moment that stretched itself out. "I don't lie," he said. "It's actually one of the things I can't do, not convincingly." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." He came away from the doorway, sat down at the kitchen table in that careful, deliberate way, like each movement was chosen. "I've been in these mountains," he said, "for a very long time, long before there were houses on them, long before there were roads." She waited. "I take different shapes," he said, "when it suits me, when it's useful. This one," he gestured at himself, at the flannel shirt and the long hands and the dark eyes, "is one I've used before when I want to speak to someone." "To speak to someone," she said. "Yes." "You came to speak to me." "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her, and something in those dark eyes was very old and very calm, and she had the sudden certain feeling that she was being looked at by something that had watched this mountain be a different shape than it currently was. "You've been here for 3 years, alone. You kept the herbs, you kept the old ways, even though you didn't know that's what you were doing." She thought of her grandmother, the bundles of herbs, keeping the house honest. "What does that mean?" she asked. "The keeping." "It means," he said, "that something is being maintained, a kind of agreement, between the people in this place and the things that were here before the people. And you're one of the things. I'm the oldest of them," he said, not proudly, just as a fact. She slept on it. Literally, she said, "I need to sleep on that," and went to bed at 9 p.m. and lay there for 2 hours not sleeping, and then eventually did sleep, and in the morning she felt the strange peacefulness that sometimes comes after a long night of not sleeping, that fragile clarity. He was in the yard when she came out, facing the trees, still. "Okay," she said. He turned.
tell me about the agreement." He told her, standing in the early morning light, in his careful, unhurried way, while she stood with both hands around her coffee mug. The families that had come to this hollow, this specific hollow, in this specific fold of mountain, in the 1700s, had found it already occupied, not by people, by something older. There had been fear initially, the usual fear, but her people, her grandmother's grandmother's grandmother, going back as far as names went in the family, had been practical women, Appalachian women, which meant women who understood that the world was full of things that didn't fit comfortably into any category, and that you dealt with them the way you dealt with everything, directly, without fuss, with appropriate respect. An agreement had been made. The details were, he admitted, somewhat complex, but the broad shape of it was this. The hollow would be left as it was. The forest would not be cleared beyond a certain boundary. Certain practices would be maintained, the herbs, certain small observances that had been passed down as folk custom, as superstition, as grandmother's recipes for keeping the peace, and in return, the things of the forest would keep their distance, would respect the boundary between wild and kept. Your grandmother, he said, was the last one who truly understood the shape of it, who knew what she was maintaining and why. And now she's gone. Yes. So the agreement? Still holds, he said. You've been keeping it without knowing. The herbs, the way you leave the garden edge unmown, the way you've never cut into the tree line. She thought about that. She'd always told herself those things were just habit, just aesthetics, just a preference for a certain wildness at the edges. But it's fraying, he said. Without someone who understands it, these things fray. And when they fray... He stopped. What happens when they fray? He looked at the tree line. Things come closer, he said. Things that aren't me. Things that aren't interested in agreements. She spent the next several days asking him questions. He answered them. Not always fully, not always in ways that resolved into clean, simple sentences, but he answered them. What was he exactly? Old, he said. Old enough that the category doesn't translate well into words you have. Did he have a name, a real one? Many, he said, none of them in English. What did he want from her? A long pause. I wanted to meet you, he said. I wanted to see if you were what I thought you might be. And what did you think I might be? Someone who could understand this, he said. Someone who wouldn't run. She hadn't run. She thought that probably said something about her that she didn't fully want to examine. She asked him, one evening, to show him. He had been sitting across from her in the kitchen, and she'd been looking at his face, at the high cheekbones and the two dark eyes and the careful stillness, and she said, I want to see what you actually look like. He went still in a way that was different from his usual stillness, a considering stillness. You're sure? I'm not, she said honestly. But I'm asking anyway. He went out to the yard. She followed. It was a clear night, the sky actually visible above the small clearing, more stars than she'd ever seen in a city, more than she'd thought the sky was capable of. The moon was high and full, and the yard was blue-silver with it. He stood in the middle of the yard with his back to her, and then he was different. Not in a sudden violent way, not in any way she could catch the exact moment of. 1 second she was looking at the shape of a tall man in a flannel shirt, and then her eyes felt like they were adjusting to a new kind of dark, like the moment when you've been in a dim room long enough to finally start seeing the furniture, and she was looking at something else, something long, something that moved with a slow, weightless grace, the way very large things move when they have all the time in the world. She stood there. Her heartbeat was doing something complicated, but her feet did not move. She did not run. He was back in a moment. She still couldn't catch the moment of the change, standing in the moonlight in the flannel shirt, watching her. Okay, she said. Her voice was entirely level. She was proud of that. Okay, he agreed. She thought about it. That's actually very beautiful. Something crossed his face,
something that wasn't the calibrated smile, something smaller and less certain, something she hadn't seen there before. "No one said that before," he said. "Really? Most people run. I told you I wasn't going to. People say a lot of things." She looked at him across the silver yard, this thing that was old beyond her ability to comprehend, that had watched this mountain in its previous shapes, that had made agreements with her great-great-grandmothers. "What happens now?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "That's a surprisingly honest answer." "I told you," he said. "I don't lie." She asked him to teach her. She didn't ask it lightly. She thought about it for a week in which he came and went, appearing at the tree line, sometimes at her door, sometimes simply already in the yard when she woke. And at the end of the week, she asked, "The herbs, the old ways, whatever my grandmother knew, I want to actually learn it." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I live here," she said. "Because this is my home. Because if I'm maintaining something, I want to know what I'm maintaining. It will take a long time. I'm not going anywhere." He began to teach her. It was nothing like she expected. She'd half imagined something dramatic, rituals, incantations, something you'd see in a movie. Instead, it was almost mundane, the practical knowledge of very old women. Which herb kept what at bay, not because of magic exactly, but because the things that lived in the old forest had long memories and long grudges and long associations, and certain smells meant this is a maintained place, this is a kept place, move along. Which nights required which small observances, not ceremonies, nothing theatrical, just specific acts done in specific ways, leaving a bowl of clean water by the garden edge, walking the property line at certain times of year, saying certain words, not in any language she recognized, and he taught her those words carefully, phonetically, telling her the meaning of each one. "What language is this?" "Older than language," he said. "Shape and sound before words had meaning." She said the words badly at first, and he corrected her without impatience, the way a good teacher corrects, not making her feel foolish, just showing her the difference between what she'd done and what was needed. She got better. In the evenings, they sat on the porch. She stopped keeping the shotgun by the door. She never made a decision about that. She just noticed one day that she hadn't thought about it in weeks. They talked about the mountain, about the things he'd seen on it, about her grandmother, about Nora's childhood and what she remembered of the old women and their old knowledge. He listened well. He asked questions that made her realize he was genuinely curious about her, about the particular texture of one human life, about the particular way the years felt when you were moving through them rather than watching them from the outside. "Does it feel fast?" he asked once. "Human time?" She thought about it. "Sometimes," she said. "The years go fast, the nights go slow." He nodded slowly, as if filing that away. "The years went fast for me too," he said, "for the first several hundred." She laughed. It occurred to her that she laughed more than she had in a long time. She did not at any point tell anyone. There was no one, really, to tell. Her mother was gone. She had a cousin in Knoxville she texted on birthdays. She had co-workers in Charlotte she'd never met. But there was also something else, something she recognized as a kind of protectiveness, not of herself, of this, of whatever this was. It was hers. It was the Hollow's. It didn't belong in the light of anyone else's understanding. Late one August night, she asked him the question she'd been holding for weeks. They were in the kitchen. She'd made tea. He held his mug the way he always did, carefully, respectfully, like an object he was honoring rather than using. "Do you feel things?" she asked. "Like what I feel, emotions?" He considered it. "I feel things," he said. "They don't have the same names. They're not organized the same way yours are, I think. But, yes. What do you feel right now?" Another pause, one of his long, honest ones.
Something I don't have a word for in any language I know, he said. Something like a door I've walked past many times, and one day it was open, and I walked through it, and on the other side was... He stopped. Was what? Something I didn't expect to find. She looked at him across the kitchen table, at the dark eyes and the careful hands, and the face that was almost right and had become, in the months of knowing him, entirely, specifically, his. Yeah, she said, me too. The summer became fall. The fall became the specific Appalachian fall that people drive hours to see, the red and gold of it, the particular cold smoke of October in the mountains, the way the light comes through the canopy at a lower angle and makes everything look like an oil painting of itself.
Nora kept the herbs. She walked the boundary. She said the old words. She was good at it by now. Better, he told her, than anyone had been in 2 generations. How can you tell? She asked. Things are quieter, he said. The other things. They've settled back. Is that good? It's balanced, he said, which is what good means out here. He told her one October evening that he would have to go. Not forever, not in any way that meant something final, but the mountain was long, and his range, the word he used was something else, something in the older language, but she understood it as range. His range extended far past her property, past the hollow, past the ridge she could see from her east window. How long? I don't measure it that way. Try. He thought about it. Before the first snow, he said. I'll be back before the first snow. He left on a Tuesday. She watched him walk to the tree line, and then he was not there anymore, not in any way she could track. One moment there was the shape of a tall man with dark hair at the edge of the forest, and then the morning light shifted, and there was only the trees. She stood on the porch for a while. Then she went inside and made coffee, and sat at her desk and opened her spreadsheets. The numbers needed entering. The mountain remained. She found herself talking to the forest, not in any way she thought was foolish, not expecting answers, not thinking there was some general sentience out there listening, but in the way of maintenance, in the way of keeping. Walking the property line in the evening, she narrated the day. Small things. The tomatoes were done. She'd ordered new books. There was a hawk that had been hunting the meadow edge all week. It felt like keeping a house honest, like saying, I'm here, I'm paying attention, this place is tended. She understood her grandmother in a way she hadn't when her grandmother was alive. She thought about that on the long evenings, with the fire going and the wind in the pines, and she thought, this is what it means to be from somewhere, not where you were born, where you've made yourself accountable. The first snow came on a Sunday in November. She awoke to the white silence of it, that particular hush that snow makes, the way it cancels ordinary sound and leaves something more fundamental underneath. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window and at the tree line, standing in the new snow with his dark eyes and his careful stillness, looking toward the house, Cahill. She raised her mug in a small acknowledgement. He raised a hand. She went to the door. There are places in the Appalachian Mountains that aren't on any map. Hollows and folds in the ancient stone where the trees grow impossibly thick and the sky becomes a rumor. And in some of those places, if the old agreements have been kept, if the herbs are correct and the boundary is walked, and someone says the old words with the proper understanding of what they mean, something keeps its distance. Something enormous and old and patient.
something that has made its peace with certain doors being closed. But in other places, rarer places, particular places, places where the right person has been living in the right way for long enough to have earned a different kind of relationship, the doors open, and something walks through it. And what happens in those places, in those houses, in those long winter evenings with the fire and the snow and the two presences in one kitchen, that belongs to the hollow. That belongs to the old agreement. That is not for any map.
It's 1922, Newark, New Jersey. A young woman is getting ready for a night out. She's 19 years old. Her name is Grace, and tonight she wants to look special. So she does something a little playful. She paints her teeth with the stuff from work. She paints her fingernails, her face, even her dress. And when the lights go out, she glows. Bright, beautiful, ethereal green. Her friends laugh. Her date is amazed. She feels like magic. What she doesn't know, what none of them know, is that the substance coating her skin, her nails, her lips, her teeth, is slowly killing her. And the men who gave it to her, they knew. They always knew. Welcome back. Today we are going deep into one of the darkest, most deliberately hidden stories in American history. A story about young women who were told they were painting the future and were instead handed a death sentence. This is the story of the Radium Girls. And by the end of this video, you're going to be angry, you're going to be heartbroken, and you're going to remember their names.
To understand what happened to these women, you need to understand what the world thought radium was in the early 1900s. Short answer? They thought it was a miracle. Marie Curie had discovered radium in 1898, and when scientists realized it glowed in the dark, this beautiful, ghostly, greenish light, the world went absolutely wild for it. This was an era before we truly understood radiation, before Geiger counters became standard, before anyone had mapped out what invisible energy could do to a human body from the inside out. What people saw was a mysterious element that glowed, that gave off heat, that seemed to have endless energy. So naturally, the early 20th century decided, let's put it in everything. And I mean everything. Radium water, radium chocolate, radium face cream, radium toothpaste, advertised as making your teeth whiter and your smile more vibrant. There was even a radium-infused contraceptive jelly. One company sold a ceramic crock called the Revigator. You filled it with water. The radium in the walls would energize the water overnight. The instructions said to drink 6 or more glasses a day. People genuinely believed radium made you healthier, more vigorous, more alive. So when the United States Radium Corporation opened a factory in Orange, New Jersey in 1917 and started hiring young women to paint watch dials with radium paint, it wasn't seen as a dangerous job. It was seen as a good job. The pay was excellent, far more than most women could make in a factory at that time. The work was considered skilled. It required a steady hand and a sharp eye. The girls who were hired were proud. They called themselves dial painters. And the glowing paint they used, the company had a name for it. They called it Undark.
Should have been a red flag, maybe. But back then, it just sounded magical. The dial painting studio was actually a nice place to work by the standards of the time. It was light and airy. The girls sat at long tables, bent over tiny watch faces, painting the numbers and hands with fine-pointed brushes. There was laughter, gossip, friendships formed. There were hundreds of them, mostly young women, some as young as 14 or 15. Many were recent immigrants or daughters of immigrants, Irish, Italian, Polish families, working-class girls who saw this job as a genuine opportunity. The paint itself was a mixture of radium, zinc sulfide, water, and glue. And it had one small technical problem. The brushes kept losing their fine point. So the supervisors, following official company technique, taught the girls to do something called lip pointing. You put the brush between your lips. You use your tongue and lips to reshape the bristles into a sharp tip. Then you dip it in the paint. Then you paint the dial. Lip, dip, paint. Lip, dip, paint. Over and over. All day. Every day. Each time they did this, they ingested a small amount of radium paint. Now here's the crucial thing. The people at the top, the executives, the scientists employed by the company, they knew about the dangers of radium by this point. The evidence was starting to build. Radium's energy didn't just pass through matter. It damaged it. It broke apart cells. It interfered with the body's ability to repair itself. Workers at other radium facilities were getting sick. And the United States Radium Corporation's own scientists? They wore lead aprons. They used lead-tipped tools. They handled radium with forceps, never with bare hands. But the dial painters? They were told the paint was harmless. They were told it was good for them, even. One supervisor reportedly told the girls that swallowing a little radium would put roses in their cheeks. So the girls laughed and joked about their glowing fingers. They painted their nails with the stuff after hours. Some painted their faces to surprise their boyfriends. They took the magic home with them, without even knowing it. And inside their bones, because radium behaves a lot like calcium in the human body, it was quietly, methodically making itself at home. The body, confused by the similarity, absorbed radium just like it absorbed calcium, stored it in teeth, in bones, in bone marrow. And there it began to fire off radiation. Not once, not occasionally, constantly, for the rest of their lives. By the early 1920s, the girls started getting sick. It didn't happen all at once. It crept in quietly, the way the worst things always do. The first sign for many of them was their teeth. Toothaches that wouldn't quit, abscesses that formed for no clear reason, dentists who were baffled because these were young, otherwise healthy women. Their teeth shouldn't be rotting out of their heads. But they were. And then, when the dentists pulled those teeth, what happened next was almost incomprehensible. The jaw didn't heal. Instead, it crumbled. The bone, saturated with radium, had become fragile and rotten. It would develop holes, abscesses, strange growths. In some cases, doctors could press on a woman's cheek and feel the bone literally move beneath the skin, because it had broken apart on the inside. One doctor described it this way. He could remove entire sections of jaw with his bare hands. No tools needed. The bone just came away. Meet Molly Maggia. She was one of the first to fall seriously ill. She'd been a dial painter at the factory, a good one. She started complaining about a toothache in 1921. Within months, the infections had spread through her jaw, then through the bones of her face, then through her skull. The pain was extraordinary. Doctors had never seen anything like it.
By the time she died, in September 1922, at just 24 years old, her jawbone had been almost entirely removed in an attempt to stop the decay. It hadn't worked. Her official cause of death? Syphilis. Let that sink in. Molly Maggia, a young working-class woman dying of a mysterious, horrifying disease, was labelled as having syphilis, a disease that carried a devastating social stigma, a disease that implied moral failing. It was a lie, and it wasn't an accident. The company doctor who signed that death certificate, Dr. Edwin Lehman, worked for the United States Radium Corporation. He wasn't an independent physician. He was their guy. And as more women started getting sick, as the pattern became undeniable, the company responded not with concern, but with strategy. Deny, delay, discredit. They hired outside doctors to evaluate the workers and declare them healthy, even when they clearly were not. They suggested the women's illnesses were caused by other factors, lifestyle choices, prior diseases, bad luck. Meanwhile, the women kept dying. Hazel Vincent, Ella Eckert, Irene Rudolph, Albina Larice, Helen Quinlan. Name after name after name. These weren't abstractions. They were daughters, sisters, friends, women who had simply gone to work at a well-paying job and done what they were told. And by the mid-1920s, the doctors who were genuinely trying to figure out what was happening, researchers at Columbia University, for instance, were beginning to piece it together. The cause wasn't a mystery anymore. It was radium. But the company had known far longer than that. Documents would later reveal that by 1924, internal reports were confirming what the scientists already suspected. They'd done studies. They had data. They chose to suppress it. By the late 1920s, some of the surviving women decided they weren't going to go quietly. And that decision, made by women who were already dying, who could barely lift their arms, whose bodies were literally disintegrating, that decision changed American history. The first major legal battle came from a group of 5 women in New Jersey. They became known in the press as the Radium Girls. Their names were Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta MacDonald, and Albina Larice. They sued the United States Radium Corporation in 1927, and it was hard. Not because they lacked evidence. The medical evidence was overwhelming at this point. Independent researchers had confirmed radium poisoning beyond any reasonable doubt. It was hard because the system wasn't built for them. Their case faced a statute of limitations problem. New Jersey law said you had to file a personal injury lawsuit within 2 years of the injury. But radium poisoning doesn't show up in 2 years. It takes a decade to manifest. By the time these women knew they were sick, the legal window had technically closed. The company's lawyers used this aggressively.
And the company itself was no small outfit. They had money, they had lawyers, they had connections. They stalled, they filed motions, they delayed hearings. Meanwhile, the women's condition worsened. Grace Fryer had a back brace just to sit upright. Catherine Schaub could barely speak. These women were attending court dates while dying. The press started paying attention, and suddenly public opinion shifted. Because there is something uniquely powerful about watching 5 young, dying women sit in a courtroom and demand justice from the company that killed them. The judge, sympathetic to their condition, agreed to expedite the hearings. He let them testify quickly while they still could. The case never went to full trial. In June 1928, the United States Radium Corporation settled. Each woman received $10,000, the equivalent of roughly $170,000 today. They also received $600 per year for medical bills for as long as they lived, which, for most of them, wasn't going to be very long. It wasn't a massive victory in dollar terms, but what it represented, that was enormous. For the first time, a corporation had been held legally accountable for knowingly exposing workers to a dangerous substance. For the first time, the idea that employers had a duty to protect their employees, not just from obvious accidents, but from invisible, long-term harms, was tested in court and upheld. And then there was Catherine Donahue. She worked at a different factory, the Radium Dial Company in Ottawa, Illinois. Her story ran a few years behind New Jersey's because the illness took time to manifest. But by the mid-1930s, she was dying too. And she fought too. Even when she was so sick, she had to be carried into the courtroom on a stretcher. Even when the company argued with straight faces that she was making it all up, that she was a liar seeking money she didn't deserve. She won. The Illinois Industrial Commission ruled in her favor in 1938. The ruling was upheld by the Illinois Supreme Court. Catherine Donahue died a few months later. She was 34 years old. But she had won. She had made them admit it. And somewhere in the paper trail of that case, in the court documents and depositions and scientific reports, was the foundation of something entirely new. The idea that workers had rights. That companies couldn't just use people up and throw them away. That "I didn't know" was not an acceptable defense when you clearly did know. Here's the thing about history that's easy to miss when you're just reading names and dates. Every protection you have at work right now, someone died to get it. Every workplace safety regulation, every requirement that companies disclose known hazards, every law that says an employer cannot lie to you about what you're being exposed to, someone, some group of people, usually people without power, usually people who had nothing to gain for themselves because they were already dying, fought for that. The Radium Girls are a direct line to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, created in 1970. To the modern field of occupational medicine. To the legal principle that companies can be held liable not just for accidents, but for decisions. Deliberate decisions. The kind where someone sits in a boardroom, looks at a report that says our workers are being poisoned, and decides, we'll suppress that. We'll fight the lawsuits. We'll call them liars. We'll outlast them. Because they knew these women were poor. They knew they were young. They knew they didn't have lawyers on retainer. They knew the system wasn't built for them. What they didn't know, what they couldn't account for, was sheer, burning stubbornness. The willingness of dying women to spend their last energy in a courtroom, to put their names in newspapers, to be described in agonizing physical detail by medical experts, stripped of every dignity, all in service of making sure that some company somewhere had to admit what they did. The Radium Girls also left a scientific legacy. Literally. Because radium decays slowly. Its half-life is 1,600 years. The bodies of the dial painters are still radioactive today. Researchers have studied these women's remains to understand radiation's effects on human bone. Their sacrifice, involuntary, unknowing, horrific, actually contributed to the development of radiation safety standards that protect nuclear workers to this day. They didn't know they were giving that gift. They didn't consent to it. But somehow, even in death, they kept being useful. And if that makes you feel uncomfortable, good, it should. Because that's the complicated, ugly, true nature of this story. These women were used by their company. Their deaths were used by science. And the only thing they chose, consciously, deliberately, was to fight back. That part was theirs.
There's one more thing I want to tell you. In 2011, a young woman named Kate Moore was doing research for what would become her book, The Radium Girls. She visited the towns where these women had lived and worked. In Ottawa, Illinois, where Catherine Donahue and her co-workers had laboured, she discovered something strange. The contamination was still there. Houses built near the old factory sites, children's playgrounds, community spaces, all showing elevated radiation readings nearly a century after the factory closed. The Radium Dial Company had been gone for decades, but what they'd done was still in the ground, still in the walls. Some things don't clean up easy. Some things don't go away when the company closes, or the executives retire, or the lawyers move on to other cases. Some damage is permanent. And some stories need to be told again and again, not because they're comfortable, but because they're true. Because the people in them deserve to be remembered.
Because when you know what happened to Grace Fryer and Molly Maggia and Catherine Donahue and hundreds of women whose names we don't even know, you understand something real about power, about who gets protected and who gets sacrificed, about what it costs to fight, even when fighting is the only thing you have left. The Radium Girls glowed in the dark. They glowed in courtrooms too. And they should glow in our memory. If this story hit you the way it hit me, share it, talk about it, leave a comment below telling me which part surprised you most. I read every single one. And if you're new here, this is what we do. We dig into the stories that got buried, the histories that got sanitized, the people who got erased. So subscribe, because there are so many more stories to tell. I'll see you in the next one.